Now, I'm sure that for all of you awesome viewers living in the US, blondes are like a dime a dozen. But for a little Asian boy born and raised in the Philippines, seeing a natural blonde in person was about as rare as spotting a unicorn. And no, this guy doesn't count. But to drive my point, this dude, Redford White, was a local actor and comedian who gained popularity mostly because of his blonde hair. The reason I bring this up is that unlike the tired stereotype of blondes being simple-minded or empty-headed, growing up I saw them as something more exotic, even heroic, thanks to characters like Luke Skywalker, the farm boy from Tatooine with a greater destiny as a Jedi, or the star-spangled Avengers assembling Steve Rogers, aka Captain America, or the very tanned but still definitely blonde most powerful man in the universe, He-Man. Blonde dudes weren't jokes, they were leaders, the main characters, and the heroes of their stories. And so during my very first trip to the US, and more importantly, my very first visit to the hallowed halls of Toys R Us, I found myself staring at a wall of real American heroes. And being given the difficult choice of just picking one, I naturally used my light-haired logic and went with the first blonde I saw. Surely, he had to be the leader. Unfortunately, I was way off. Despite my lofty intentions, I didn't walk out with the face of G.I. Joe. Instead, I ended up with Short Fuse. Now, no offense to any Short Fuse fans out there, but as a chosen one, he felt more like, well, skeleton boogers. That being said, my blonde, ambitious reasoning wasn't completely wrong because at the time, the actual leader of G.I. Joe was blonde. He just wasn't sold as a single-carded figure like most of the team. Instead, Hasbro packed him in with the Mobile Missile System, or MMS for short, which honestly was kind of a puzzling decision if you ask me. See, aside from the added articulation and accessories, which was already a huge game changer, one of the big things Hasbro did to set G.I. Joe apart from its main predecessor, Star Wars, was to pack unique characters in with their vehicles. But as a kid, I always saw these pack-in figures more as second-class citizens of the line. Like, if they were really that important, they would have been sold on their own card, right? Which made Hasbro's decision to release the leader of the G.I. Joe team, Hawk, as a pack-in with the MMS, a vehicle that, let's be honest, wasn't exactly the most exciting of the first wave, even stranger. Hasbro didn't even go out of their way to advertise him as the leader. His file card simply listed his role as Missile Commander. And only in the very last line of his file card did it finally state that he was an excellent leader. Talk about burying the lead. I remember the first time I actually got my hands on Hawk and the MMS. Technically, the toy wasn't mine. It was given to my older brother in what must have been one of those parental attempts at teaching us siblings how to play together. I ended up with the Vamp and its driver, Clutch, which in hindsight, I guess they hoped I would use to haul around my brother's missile system. But honestly, I wasn't too upset because I always felt like I scored the cooler deal. I mean, Clutch had the better ride, and he oozed personality. Well, actually, that was most likely the motor oil he used to slick back his hair. He also called women chicks and came off like the Joe with the most swagger. In my book, that made him way cooler than Missile Commander Hawk. And if you thought otherwise, well, bless your heart. Regardless of my less than glowing first impression of Hawk though, looking back as an adult, I believe that I can actually make sense of his unusual debut in the line. Sure, toys like the Vamp, the Mobat Tank, or even the Ram Cycle were way more exciting to play with. But in the real world, all of their combined firepower would most likely pale compared to a long-range missile system. The MMS might not have looked flashy, but it represented something far more devastating, a weapon that could take out key Cobra targets from a distance. So it would make sense that someone of Hawk's caliber was assigned to command it. His file card paints a picture of, well, the cat's pajamas. Arguably the most accomplished Joe on the roster at the time. Born Clayton M. Abernathy, he came from a well-established, really loaded family. But instead of rock and rolling all night and partying every day, he went the hard route, spending his days in La Biblioteca, becoming a West Point graduate, top of his class, and a seasoned soldier with experience in multiple global hot zones. And on top of all that, Hawk wasn't just book smart and battle tested. He was described as keenly intelligent, perceptive, and capable of completely selfless acts to support his teammates. Basically, if you were going to entrust one Joe to oversee the Army's equivalent of a tactical nuke on wheels, Hawk was your man. Now, while the toy line wasn't all that clear about Hawk's status as the leader of the team, the comics left no doubt he was the man in charge. From issue number 1 of Marvel's G.I. Joe: A Real American Hero, Hawk is firmly established as the team's field commander, the guy calling the shots, being prominently featured in the first issue cover, fearlessly leaping off the Mobat tank, and also on the top right corner box. But Hawk's story in the comics actually begins even earlier, before the team's official debut. During the Vietnam War era, Hawk was stationed stateside and found himself with one of the hardest duties imaginable. When a young injured soldier returned home, Hawk was the one tasked with breaking the news that his entire family had been killed in a car crash on their way to pick him up. That soldier would go on to be Hasbro's top money-making Joe, Snake Eyes, and Hawk's compassion in that moment forged a lifelong bond between them. And speaking of lifelong bonds, while I'm not delusional into thinking I can form lifelong bonds with every single one of you awesome viewers, how about we start out small, with something more manageable: lifelong watch time. Okay, I'll settle for extended watch time. If you're enjoying this video, why not give other stories on my channel a shot? Apparently, keeping all you entertained for longer amounts of time is what actually helps my channel out big time. So yeah, just keep watching more of my videos. Heck, keep me babbling about in the background while you go about your day, and you will really make mine. But as always, any way you choose to help would be very much appreciated, so thank you. Now, Hawk Tua, the show. Okay, I'm sorry. That was a pretty lame transition. So, anyway, years later, Hawk would command a peacekeeping mission in the war-torn nation of Barovia. And it's here that a sergeant under his charge, Lonzo Stalker Wilkinson, resorted to extreme interrogation methods to stop a bombing in a refugee camp. Hawk refused to turn him over, even though that decision nearly cost him everything. Hawk openly admitted Stalker's actions were wrong, but insisted that he would have done the same in his place, placing the responsibility squarely on his own shoulders. That principled stand earned Hawk a court-martial and painted the target on his back, as his furious commanding general went so far as to hire mercenaries to have him killed. Fortunately, Hawk's resolve didn't go unnoticed. Another highly decorated officer, General Lawrence J. Flagg, intervened, threatening to expose the murder plot unless the charges were dropped. More importantly, Flagg, flagged Hawk as the man he wanted to lead his new special counter-terrorist group Delta, codenamed G.I. Joe. Promoted to field commander, Hawk's first recruit was Stalker, and together they helped bring in Snake Eyes and the rest of the original 13, who would form the backbone of America's daring, highly trained Special Mission Force. And the rest, you could say, is history. From here, Hawk, as the G.I. Joe's no-nonsense, hard-nosed leader, really takes shape on the comic page. As field commander, he led the Joes through some of their earliest and most dangerous missions, often right on the front lines himself. And this nearly cost him his own life in issue number 16, when in the middle of a desperate brawl with Destro on the back of his tank, Cobra Commander shoots Hawk. But despite multiple bullets in his back and falling off the speeding tank, somehow, Hawk survived. Okay, fine, he was wearing a SWAT vest, but still, that's gotta hurt. Anyway, even while hospitalized, he refused to be sidelined, holding on to his holster and firearm, which ultimately proved to be quite fictitious. When Cobra mercenary Major Blood tried to escape custody through the very same hospital, Hawk was the one who foiled him, proving that command didn't stop just because you're heavily bandaged up. Unfortunately, despite Hawk's maximum effort, that slippery rascal Major Blood would ultimately manage to escape a few issues later, but not before murdering General Flagg, leaving a devastating leadership void at the top of the Joe team. Once Hawk fully recovered, he was promoted to overall commander of G.I. Joe, with the newly introduced Golden Boy, Duke, stepping in as the team's field leader. And speaking of Duke, his starring role in the very first animated miniseries meant Hawk was essentially benched in the cartoon for the time being. Hasbro's reasoning was simple. By the time the series aired, Hawk's MMS toy had long disappeared from the shelves, while Duke was front and center as the new blonde of the brand. Still, while Hawk was a non-entity in the early cartoons, his story continued in the comics. There, he often fought the good fight in the background, not just against Cobra, but against political pressure from corrupt generals determined to shut the Joe team down. Speaking of which, during a crucial inspection of the G.I. Joe headquarters, the Pit, Hawk meets with three high-ranking military officers, Generals Ryan and Hollingsworth and Admiral Dyson, where deep inside the pit, they are attacked by a horde of Cobra Battle Android Troopers, or BATs. With the rest of the Joe team temporarily quartered off-site, the four are left to fend for themselves and put up a devastating fight, destroying many androids. Unfortunately, General Ryan and Admiral Dyson die in the battle, sacrificing themselves to save the others. But the surviving general, Hollingsworth, puts all his influence behind Hawk, saving the Joe team from being decommissioned. But Hawk wasn't destined to stay in the shadows forever. In 1986, he made a triumphant return with an all-new action figure, trading his original blonde look for brown hair, likely to distinguish him from Duke. And sporting green camo pants, a sharp brown bomber jacket, and goggled helmet ensemble. Now officially a brigadier general, this updated Hawk was given a major push in the cartoon as well, making his animated debut in the miniseries Arise Serpentor Arise. And despite other high-ranking Joes like Flint and Beachhead already being fixtures on the team, Hawk was firmly established at the top, with his authority spelled out right from the opening episode. Care of Flint. Hawk's return to prominence in Arise Serpentor Arise wasn't the end of his animated journey. In the 1987 G.I. Joe the movie, he was positioned as the steady hand at the top while new blood like Lieutenant Falcon took center stage. Now, here's a fun bit of trivia. Falcon was originally intended to be Hawk's son, which is why their bird of prey codenames line up so neatly. Ultimately though, that family relation went to Duke, with Falcon becoming his half-brother. After the Sunbow era wrapped, Hawk was one of the fortunate, or is that unfortunate characters carried over into the Deke series. Though not without some radical wardrobe changes, thanks to a couple more new Hawk figures released at the time. In 1991, Hawk was equipped with a high-tech flight suit that, aside from giving off some strong Buzz Lightyear vibes, let him literally live up to his codename as a Hawk and soar into battle. A year later, a more traditional version hit shelves, wearing shades and carrying a comically oversized backpack that barked out pre-recorded lines. Let's see, I had 3 when I came in. But Hawk's wildest animated adventure came much later, in the 2004 direct-to-video movie G.I. Joe Valor vs. Venom. Here, Cobra abducted the Joe commander and subjected him to Dr. Mindbender's evolution experiments, splicing his DNA into the monstrous hybrid Venomous Maximus. Towering, savage, and disturbingly cunning, Maximus nearly usurped Cobra Commander himself, before ultimately being freed and restored to humanity by the Joe team. It was one of the darkest and strangest turns in Hawk's long history, underscoring just how important he was to both Cobra and G.I. Joe alike. But Hawk's return didn't just play out in the cartoons. In the comics, his story continued to evolve well beyond his animated appearances. In Devil's Due's continuation of the Marvel run, Hawk found himself once again butting heads with the corrupt generals known as the Jugglers, a reoccurring thorn in his side. And his career nearly came to an end when Cobra Commander, who turned out to actually be Zartan in disguise, shot him point blank, leaving Hawk paralyzed from the waist down. Despite being confined to a wheelchair, Hawk refused to fade into the background, returning to the Joe team in an advisory and reservist role, still guiding the fight against Cobra from behind the lines. And while I generally don't go in too much on alternate universes, I think that it's at least worth mentioning that in Devil's Due's take on a G.I. Joe vs. Transformers crossover, Hawk got one of the wildest moments ever. He actually managed to activate and wield the Autobot Matrix of Leadership, using its power to defeat the bizarre Decepticon Cobra love child known as Serpent OR. Anyway, after that otherworldly take on Hawk, later incarnations, specifically in the IDW comics, gave Hawk a sharper, more pragmatic edge. No longer just the idealized field commander of old, Hawk was reimagined as a seasoned, sometimes morally gray general who understood the bigger picture, even if it meant making tough or unpopular calls, and sending his own men into extremely dangerous, top secret, and clandestine missions that they more often than not don't come back from. In this continuity, Hawk was far from the frontline fighter of old and more of a strategist pulling the strings, often clashing with other leaders over how best to deal with Cobra and the shifting global landscape. This version of Hawk reflected a post 9/11 world where the lines between right and wrong weren't always as clear, and it cemented him as not just a soldier, but a symbol of leadership evolving with the times. Although, a cynic would be quick to point out that, ironically, this modern version of Hawk would end up becoming one of those jaded and secretive generals that the original, more idealistic version of Hawk would constantly battle against. Admittedly, it's not my preferred treatment of the guy, but you know what they say, if you can't be good at it. And well, this Hawk was
pretty good
at being shady. But it wasn't all darkness and morally gray takes for Hawk in the modern era. In 2009's live-action movie G.I. Joe: The Rise of Cobra, Hawk was reintroduced on the big screen, portrayed by Dennis Quaid as the commanding general of the Joe team. While nothing out of the ordinary, Quaid's take on Hawk is a more back-to-basics but seasoned combat veteran calling the shots for the G.I. Joe team from deep within their pit headquarters, and constantly accompanied by his loyal aide, Covergirl, played by the model Karolina Kurkova. Unfortunately, despite being stationed at the heart of G.I. Joe HQ, during a Cobra surprise attack, Hawk is still gravely injured by the ninja Storm Shadow, but he ultimately survives. Unfortunately, the same can't be said for Covergirl, who is gutted by Zartan. And that would be pretty much it. Even if he didn't die, for whatever reason, Hawk would not return in the sequel, Retaliation, with his senior commanding officer role being taken over by the original G.I. Joe, Joe Colton, played by Bruce Willis. Oh well, at least this single live appearance did give us a couple more movie-based Hawk toys. I mean, if you wanted a plastic Dennis Quaid for your collection, have at it. And speaking of the toys, let's finish things up with other Hawk toys released through the years. Aside from the previously mentioned ones earlier, one more unique Hawk figure would be released in the original Real American Hero line in 1993. And when I say unique, boy did this Hawk look nothing like any Hawks before or after it. Released as part of the Star Brigade Armor Tech subset, this Hawk was hella armored up, looking twice the size, at least in width, as your typical 3 3/4 inch Joe. And if that wasn't enough, he came packed with a humongous G.I. Joe armor bot. Yeah, Hasbro was really desperate for anything to work at this point. Anyways, s'more Hawks came as part of the 25th anniversary line. A young blonde Hawk that came in a comic 2-pack with Scarlet. A more seasoned but still young and still blonde version was also part of the senior ranking officers 3-pack with Duke and Grunt. Okay. And of course, it wouldn't be a complete 25th anniversary party without an updated take on his arguably most iconic look from 1986. First released single-carded in 2008, and then as part of a special 5-pack along with Flint, Lady J, Shipwreck, and Snake Eyes. And before the 25th anniversary revival would end, we would get one more new take on Hawk as part of the awesome Pursuit of Cobra line in 2011, which was apparently so good that it was re-released in a later Eagle's Edge set with Destro and Leatherneck, celebrating the 50th anniversary of the original line, not the Real American Hero one, in 2014. And bringing up the rear would be the Collectors Club in 2017, with their take on the Hawk Lightyear figure, originally released in 1991. And finally, let's finish off this Hawk story with his latest plastic appearance, this time in the larger 6-inch size. I guess it wasn't much of a surprise that we didn't have to wait too long for Hawk to make his appearance in the G.I. Joe Classified line. In 2023, we got the Bombardier jacket sporting Brigadier General version of Hawk, which was, well, exactly what you would expect. No complaints here, especially since I was able to get this guy on clearance. But I guess to bring things in full circle, earlier this year Hasbro announced the imminent release of the OG version of Hawk, the young blonde that came with a mobile missile system, and who now will also come with an appropriately sized mobile missile system. To be honest though, I'm kind of on the fence on this one since I've already got the previous Hawk already leading my OG-13 Oh, who am I kidding? This guy is as good as bought. When it comes to an established group of characters, it's never easy being the new guy. Regardless though, introducing a cast of characters or a franchise to a potentially new audience through the point of view of an outsider is a very common storytelling device. Sometimes it works wonders with the new guy crossing over and, for better or worse, becoming a household name or at least a fan favorite, like, I don't know, Wolverine in the original 2000s X-Men movie or Jyn Erso in Rogue One. But in other cases, such as Cole Young in Mortal Kombat, or in my opinion, Andra from Kevin Smith's take on the Masters of the Universe, it doesn't go over well with the fandom, often feeling unnecessary or forced. At the end of the day, though, it all boils down to how the characters are written into the story and if they are interesting in themselves to begin with. And fortunately for Duke, the writers of the very first G.I. Joe animated miniseries did a pretty good job in introducing us to the new Joe on the block. Released in 1983, G.I. Joe, a real American hero, the mass device, was one of the most watched animated series of my childhood. I mean, by that time, I was already a huge fan of the toys, and so it was a real big deal for me to see my favorite Joe toys come to life on the television screen. Given that it was released in 1983, the show featured Joes from the first 2 years of the toy line. We got familiar 82 characters like Snake Eyes, Scarlet, and Stalker, mixed in with slightly newer ones from the following year like Gung Ho, Torpedo, and Snowjob. But there was one character I was not familiar with at all, and he was literally the first face and voice we hear in the opening intro shouting that familiar and now iconic battle cry of Yo! It really wasn't much of a surprise that I had absolutely no idea who the hell Duke, the first sergeant and apparently leader of the Joes, was. His original action figure was first made available only as an exclusive mail-away figure in 1983, something not available to a kid like me living outside of the US, and his toy would only be made available on retail in the following year. Still, that didn't stop the writers from basically making him the central character of the first miniseries. But despite the odds stacked up against Duke and the potential for things to go the wrong way for him, ultimately I believe his introduction worked. I mean, while admittedly he's not as popular or iconic as, say, Snake Eyes, he still is widely regarded as one of the main characters in the franchise. Now, I can only speculate on the reasons of why the character of Duke worked, but here's what I think. First and foremost, at the time, G.I. Joe definitely needed a leader. Sure, there was Hawk from the original wave, but for some reason, he never quite caught on, at least for me. Visually, he was just one of the other green men. His action figure even shared the exact head sculpt with another blondie in the group, Short Fuse, and it came packed in with a rather plain missile system. Nothing about him really screamed leader. In the original Marvel comics, at least for the very first few issues, the team was actually led by General Flag. Hawk was kind of a non-entity. The most eventful thing about Hawk that I remember was when he got shot by Cobra Commander and was out of commission for a bit. So when something as important as their first animated series, the Joe team needed an obvious leader that we could all latch onto, which is the role that Duke filled to a T. Secondly, from a visual standpoint, he had his own unique look, with his beige top breaking up the predominantly monochromatic look of most of the original team. And of course, he was blonde, something that almost all leaders of the 80s were for some reason. And thirdly, from the start, he was already portrayed as a cool character. In the opening action scene, he is already showing off how cool he was by doing somersaults to avoid aircraft fire from above, and simultaneously saving and flirting with the only female member of the team introduced so far in Scarlet, with his iconic line of,
"Didn't you read my green sheet? Man of action."
Which was, I believe, a nice reference to the 1960s British licensed equivalent to G.I. Joe, Action Man. Anyway, while technically Duke wasn't the new guy in the show, he was already established to be the leader of the team from the start. To the viewers like myself, he was the new guy who was meant to be the focal point for us to follow. I believe that he was designed and written to be the character that us, the kids, would want to be. Duke was easy to like. While he didn't break the mold, he was safe and very charismatic. And so the story goes, Duke is the Joe who gets captured by Cobra, fights a huge giant of a guy in some gladiatorial arena, wins the affections of another girl, and with her help manages to escape and leads the Joes to the Cobra's hidden base to ultimately win the day. This was the hero's journey that we as kids would have loved to see ourselves take. Well, for whatever reason, Duke really worked for me, and since then he has always been a favorite of mine. So much so that when I went to the US in 1985, he was the first toy that I got in Toys R Us. Well, him and Lady J. And Airtight. I don't know what it was, but as a kid, actually even now as a grown-up, I've always gravitated more towards the goody-goody Boy Scout leader type character, as opposed to the more cutting-edge, moody, and broody types. For me, it was always Captain America over Wolverine, Superman over Batman, and of course, Mickey over Donald. Actually, sorry, no. Donald is the man. Oh, I mean Duck. You know what I mean? For me, Duke checked out all of the boxes. Leader, check. Good guy, check. Competent in battle, check. Ladies man, check. Blonde, bonus check. And finally, cool voice, check. Speaking of his voice, Duke was played by the voice actor Michael Bell, who was also the voice of the Autobot military strategist, Prowl. On the flip side, Duke's evil counterpart, Cobra Commander, was voiced by the late Chris Latta, whose iconic raspy tone also gave life to the Decepticon Starscream. Anyway, I always found it funny how the voices of both the leaders in G.I. Joe basically voiced second fiddle characters to the leaders in Transformers. Anyway, while all of his cool qualities were all fine and dandy for kids, Duke's straight-laced heroic character wasn't something that in general appealed to an older audience. And as such, when many Joe fans started latching onto the slightly more serious Marvel comics, it was characters like Snake Eyes and Storm Shadow who became more popular with their more complicated backstories and more nuanced personalities. I mean, don't get me wrong, Duke was a fairly used character in the comics, and he even made a very memorable debut when he saved the entire Joe team from being gunned down by a Cobra Rattler as they lay exposed and unarmed during the funeral of General Flag. Duke arrives just in the nick of time and totally takes down the Cobra bomber with nothing but his trusty pistol. Okay, he had a little help from his buddy Roadblock and his massive Browning .50 caliber machine gun. But that's beside the point. After saving the team from certain death from above, without skipping a beat, Duke introduces himself as the new top sergeant, promising to make their sorry lot into soldiers. It's a very un-Duke portrayal, bordering more on Sergeant Slaughter territory if you ask me, which doesn't come to much of a surprise as even the legendary writer Larry Hama admitted that he never could quite get the handle of Duke's character, as in his experience in the military, it was often the commanding officer who played the good cop role to the first sergeant as the bad cop, and Duke, as first sergeant, just never really sort of fit in that bad cop mold. And speaking of his rank, as a kid, I could never quite understand how Duke, with his rank of first sergeant, could be officially recognized as the leader of the G.I. Joe team. Well, okay, if you wanted to be technical about it, second in command, after Hawk. I mean, I'm not an expert in military ranks, but anyone with access to Google can learn that technically Joes like Flint, who was a warrant officer, or even the Conquest X-30 pilot Slipstream, who was a lieutenant, should have easily outranked Duke. But the workaround this, apparently, is that Duke should have been ranked higher. It's just that he refused promotions that would effectively put him behind the battle lines, as his preference was to be out in the field with his men. As he states in his own file card, "They tell me that an officer's job is to impel others to take the risks, so that the officer survives to take the blame in the event of total catastrophe. With all due respect, sir, if that's what an officer does, I don't want any part of it." Again, from what I recall, Duke didn't do anything memorable in the original Marvel comics. But he was always in the thick of things, as during an ill-fated mission in the Middle Eastern nation of Trucial Abysmia, wherein a Joe convoy led by Duke is captured by Cobra and things turn ugly real fast. Long story short, in an unprecedented move, a good number of Joes are killed off, including original 13-member Breaker and other favorites like Doc, Crazy Legs, and Quick Kick. Of course, Duke manages to survive, which is something he seems to have a knack of being able to do most of the time. But before we go any further, I'd like to take a quick detour and invite all of you, my lovely viewers, to try out joining my channel as an awesome member. If you regularly enjoy the stories that I put out every week, I'd like to give you more. I'm talking about sweet perks like early access to my videos and exclusive ones as well, like first impressions, collection tours, latest updates, and whatever unscripted ramblings come to mind. Yes, I know that this will all cost you a teeny tiny bit, but I remain committed to making sure that it'll be worth it for you. And I will continue to add even more perks, like maybe special polls to decide what stories to tell next, as soon as I figure them out. As always, it's a little thing that will go a long way to help me grow my channel. But either way, rest assured, everything else currently on the channel, meaning the regular stories that you've been enjoying, will remain as is. This is just a little something extra. So I hope you can give being a channel member a shot. But if you're not keen on joining right now, or ever, that's perfectly fine. Your continued viewership and support is more than enough. So, thank you. Anyway, back to Duke. So apparently narrowly surviving a dire situation is something he does quite well, and in 1987, he managed to cheat death yet again thanks to the help of a certain heroic Autobot, Optimus Prime. So as the story goes, in the mid-80s, Hasbro was riding high with the financial success of a number of their toy lines, and as such, felt confident enough in 3 of their best-selling toy lines, namely Transformers, G.I. Joe, and My Little Pony, to invest into their transition to the big screen. Aside from hopefully reaching an even wider audience, one of Hasbro's main objectives for these movies was to introduce new characters to sell new toys. And as such, at least for the boy brands, the directive from above was to literally kill off characters who no longer had toys currently selling in the stores. And so in 1986, Transformers the movie made its grand debut to excited audiences, and then proceeded to kill off in rather graphic fashion familiar and favorite characters like Brawn, Prowl, Ratchet, and Ironhide, and of course, the ultimate cherry on top, the beloved Autobot leader himself, Optimus Prime. And the audience, specifically the kids, freaked out. Apparently, Hasbro sorely underestimated how much of an emotional connection kids had with the noble Autobot leader, and how traumatic it would be for them to see their hero, and in many ways their father figure, die before their eyes. Anyway, bottom line, kids cried and the parents got mad and let Hasbro know about it. The movie unfortunately bombed big time, and while not related, so did My Little Pony. This unfortunate series of events basically led Hasbro to switch the already finished G.I. Joe movie to a home video only release in 1987, with one major significant change. See, by that time, Duke's action figure had been discontinued in retail stores, and so taking a cue from Transformers, he was scheduled to meet his maker in the G.I. Joe movie as well. Story-wise, it was to make way for the G.I. Joe Falcon, who was to be introduced as the new main character of the movie and as Duke's irresponsible half-brother. Actually, the original plan was to make him Hawkson or something, hence the similar bird-themed codenames. But anyway, Duke's death scene was done and animated, wherein he selflessly takes a snake spear thrown by Serpentor, originally meant for Falcon, to his heart, and he expires in the lap of his beloved Scarlet. Yes, I am team Dukelet, or is that Scarduke? Whatever, sue me. Of course, after the whole Prime death debacle, Hasbro had to make a quick pivot, and Duke, the man of action, was saved with a hastily thrown-in line of dialogue of him slipping into a coma, and in the literal last minute of the movie, Doc proudly announcing over the comms to the rest of the team,
General Hawk, do you read me? This is Doc at headquarters. Great news. Duke's come out of his coma.
Looks like we made it. Men, Doc says Duke's gonna be A-OK. Yo, Joe!
Duke lives in the movies. Well, the animated one at least. See, apparently, Duke isn't as lucky in the live-action scene. Okay, to be fair, Duke, played by the actor Channing Tatum, was the main character in the 2009 movie, The Rise of Cobra. Now, with all due respect to the actor Channing Tatum, he wouldn't be my first choice to play Duke. I mean, visually, he really doesn't strike me as the man of action. More of the man of dance. But yeah, Tatum was Duke, and his Duke was definitely the new guy in this movie, where he and his buddy Ripcord, are recruited into the already existing International Special Missions Force, G.I. Joe. Anyway, the movie is not awful, but far from memorable or faithful to the original material, as Duke runs around Paris in some sort of mech suit and apparently is the former lover of the Baroness and former best friend of her brother, Rex, who eventually becomes the Doctor. Talk about a bizarre love triangle. Anyway, apparently, Channing Tatum, who was supposedly an OG fan of the toys, wasn't very happy with the first movie or the direction it took. Can you really blame him? In later interviews, he admitted that he hated it and only did it because he was contractually obligated to do so. And so, when plans were laid out for the 2013 sequel Retaliation, Tatum requested to have his character, Duke, killed off. And since they already had their new big star in Dwayne Johnson, aka The Rock, signed on, the producers granted Tatum's wish, and Duke was killed off in the first act of the movie. No serpent spear to the heart this time though, just some ambiguous vehicular explosion that kinda left room for his possible survival somewhere on down the line. But there was no part 3 after Retaliation, as the franchise was soft rebooted years later with the Snake Eyes origin movie. But that's a story for another time. All that's important to note here is that while Tatum's Duke is definitely dead, a new live-action Duke is still in play for whatever new continuity is still to come. And speaking of different continuities, I think it's worth noting that there have been attempts to make Duke go beyond his clean-cut Boy Scout image in later comics after the original Marvel run. Devil's Due, the publisher that took over the G.I. Joe license in the early 2000s, tried their hand at giving a fresh take on Duke. Aside from continuing where the Marvel series left off, Devil's Due also published another series called G.I. Joe Reloaded, which was meant to be a completely new and modern take on the Joes. Think Marvel's Ultimate Universe. Anyway, while I never actually read the series, it didn't last very long, it is notable for making Duke an actual traitor, an agent of Cobra who eventually meets his end at the hands of Scarlet, of all people. A more promising take, though, would be the one being done by the current license holder, Skybound Entertainment. Duke starts similarly enough as a highly decorated soldier until he literally comes face to face with the Decepticon Starscream and barely lives to tell about it. Unfortunately, his friend goes splat in between the Decepticon's hand in midair. See, being the current publishing license holder of the Transformers as well, Skybound, led by Robert Kirkman of Walking Dead fame, has been slowly and carefully crafting a new joint Energon universe. And while the whole G.I. Joe Transformers crossover thing has been done time and time again since the 80s, this time around, it seems like a really legit, long-term, maximum effort by Skybound. They're literally starting from ground zero, with the Transformers waking up and resuming their battle on an Earth where both G.I. Joe and Cobra don't exist. Yet. So anyway, Duke is one of the first humans to make contact with the robots in disguise and is extremely traumatized by his near-death experience. Duke goes rogue in an effort to uncover the truth behind the robots, much to the chagrin of the shadowy General Hawk, who sends future Joe members Stalker and Rock'n'Roll after him. Anyway, this is still an ongoing story, so the jury is still out on it, but I'm liking what I've read so far. Plus, rogue Duke with long unkempt hair and a beard? Nice! Anyway, regardless of how people may feel about Duke, even if he will never reach the heights of popularity as Snake Eyes, or if you're more of a Flint is the cooler leader guy, there's no denying Duke's importance in G.I. Joe. Ever since his very close brush with death in the 1987 movie, Duke has since always had an action figure in every iteration of G.I. Joe. As early as 1988, a new tiger-themed repainted Duke was released in retail, and finally in 1992, a completely newly sculpted Duke followed. All the way up to 2007, when the then dormant Joe toy line was relaunched with 2 box sets, one for Joe's and one for Cobra, of 5 modernized action figures each, to celebrate G.I. Joe: A Real American Hero's 25th anniversary. And not surprisingly, heading the good guys was Duke himself. And like I said, since then Duke has been everywhere. In 2009, he was the uncharacteristically badass and no-nonsense leader in the G.I. Joe Resolute micro-series, which was a more mature, realistic-ish, and definitely more violent take on the Real American Heroes. The highlight of which for me was towards the end, where Scarlet reaffirms her choice of Duke over Snake Eyes. Yes! Then, in 2010, a younger, less experienced version of Duke led a team of Joes in the cartoon series Renegades, where the Joes, or future Joes, were reimagined into a sort of ragtag, A-teamish bunch of fugitives on the run from the military, but at the same time trying to uncover and expose the suspicious activities of a pharmaceutical company called Dun 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 Cobra Industries. That same year came, in my opinion, the best 1/18th scale G.I. Joe subline called The Pursuit of Cobra, where we got two awesome Dukes. The first one was a standard-ish version that came with a futuristic portable missile system. A bit of overkill if you ask me, but it was cool nonetheless. But my favorite would have to be his jungle version, which kinda seemed like an homage to the character Dutch from the very first Predator movie. A seeming stretch until you put him together with his fellow Joes Spirit and Racondo, who looked a lot like Dutch's fellow mercenaries, Billy and Blaine respectively. And you throw in the new Cobra operative introduced, Shadow Tracker, who with his mysterious mask and dreads evokes the look of the Predator himself. And finally, in the next rebirth of the G.I. Joe toys, this time in the larger 1/12th scale, Duke was part of the very first wave of the G.I. Joe classified line. While I wasn't a big fan of the original, more futuristic design, I could not resist the straight-up retro Duke released a few years later. But as great as that Duke is, for me, my hands-down favorite would be the Ultimates version by the company Super 7, which stands slightly taller than your classified figure and is meant to be a plastic representation of Duke from the cartoons. And for me, it hits the mark in every way. Case in point, there have been Shouting Duke head sculpts done in the past that look quite laughable in my opinion. But every time I look at this guy on my shelf, that iconic "Yo Joe" that I heard in the opening intro of the cartoon always plays in my head. This is the only plastic version of Duke to completely capture that man of action that I was introduced to all the way back in 1983. And when paired up with a reissued vintage Duke with an updated, more tune-accurate paint job, man, this duo is just complete nostalgic perfection for me. Do you know what a Rhodes Scholar is? It's one of the most prestigious academic honors in the world, a scholarship that sends only the best of the best to study at Oxford University. And if you know anything about Oxford, you know it's not exactly an easy place to get into, much less excel in. It takes a certain kind of person, disciplined, determined, laser-focused, someone who doesn't just work hard, but lives for the challenge. People like that are rare, and when they set their sights on something, success usually isn't a question, it's an expectation. Now, imagine someone with that kind of drive and intellect, a Rhodes Scholar, top of his class with a degree in English literature, trading in the quiet halls of academia for the chaos of the battlefield, channeling that same discipline and precision not into essays or lectures, but into surviving and excelling through airborne school, ranger school, special forces school, and finally flight warrant officer school, graduating each with honors. That, in a nutshell, is Flint, G.I. Joe's warrant officer, scholar, soldier, and proof that brains and bronze don't have to live in separate worlds. To the casual fan, Flint is one of the leaders of America's highly trained Special Mission Force, or, Lady J's boy toy. But there's a lot more to Flint than that. So to get the ball rolling, or in Flint's case, to get the sparks flying, what exactly is a warrant officer? Because if you're anything like me, the first thing that comes to mind with the word warrant is that awesome 80s band singing about heaven not being too far away. Rest in peace, Janie Lane. But no, in military terms, a warrant officer isn't a rock star, though they might as well be. They're the military's go-to technical experts, the specialized problem solvers who bridge the gap between the troops and the brass. They're not bosses, they're masters of their craft. While commissioned officers focus on strategy and planning, warrant officers are the ones who make those plans actually work. They sit in that sweet spot where real experience meets real responsibility. If the army were a business, the commissioned officers would be the CEOs setting the vision, and the warrant officers would be the ones who actually know how everything works. They're the pilots, the tacticians, the specialists, the ones who keep the machine running when things get messy. In short, they're not just soldiers, they're the glue that holds the mission together. And when it comes to Flint, that's exactly his lane. He's a tactical planner through and through. The kind of guy who can read a battlefield, map out a solution, and then personally lead the charge. According to his file card, Flint drafted and led over a dozen covert rescue operations deep into hostile territory. Missions so classified they were never acknowledged, much less publicized. He's the guy who plans the impossible and then actually pulls it off. Or as one Rescue Joe once put it, "We thought Cobra had us locked in that stinking dungeon for good. Then we heard the chopper coming in and the hardware going off like the 4th of July. Next thing we know, the door blows open and there's Flint with that lopsided grin singing, 'Come on boys, we're going home.'" So, like a lot of 80s kids, my first introduction to Flint wasn't through the toys or the comics. It was on TV, specifically in the 1984 G.I. Joe sequel miniseries, The Revenge of Cobra. And right from the start, Flint takes charge, taking command of the Joe team after Duke gets captured in the opening battle. And from there, he's thrown straight into his own full-blown side adventure. Flint teams up with fellow newcomer Mutt and his dog Junkyard, and the trio instantly find themselves in one of the most random yet perfectly G.I. Joe sequences ever. Thanks to Destro's Weather Dominator, they crash into a pit full of killer strangler vines, fight their way out, commandeer a Stinger Jeep, some Cobra soldier duds, and stumble into a seedy Cobra-controlled bar. Get into a bar fight, come across some dude named Shipwreck who takes him across the desert on his sand skiff only to run into, what else? A huge sandstorm because, no Joe mission is complete without a natural disaster. Which of course they escape before finally making it back to Joe headquarters, dusty, bruised, but more than ready for the final round. The Revenge of Cobra also gave us the debut of what some regard as Flint's better half, Lady J. Because like peanut butter and chocolate, mac and cheese, or lasers and explosions, some things just belong together. Now, while the show never went overboard with the romance, flirty shipwreck moments, and bikini-clad Baroness interactions aside, the chemistry between Flint and Lady J was definitely there. It started off subtle, teased here and there, and eventually became one of the most natural, easygoing relationships in the entire series. Throughout the cartoon's run, the two were always looking out for each other, whether it was Flint rescuing Lady J from a secret underground cult in skeletons in the closet. Though honestly, the only thing I vividly remember from that episode was this. Or Lady J saving Flint after he gets hypnotized by Cobra during Flint's vacation. And of course, who could forget that blink and you'll miss it moment during the evacuation of Cobra La in G.I. Joe, the movie. Their connection was built on mutual trust, shared respect, and the classic 80s, we're not saying it, but everyone knows, kind of love story. In fact, it's heavily implied and later confirmed by the writers that the two eventually got married, because years later in the Transformers cartoon of all places, we meet their daughter, Marissa Fairborn, a member of the Earth Defense Command, or EDC for short, and a frequent ally of the Autobots. And while her parents are never mentioned by name, her father, or at least an illusion of him, makes a cameo voiced by the same voice actor that brought Flint to life in the G.I. Joe cartoon. And since I mentioned it, let's talk about the voice. Look, I'll admit, to set the record straight, Flint's just okay with me. I've always been more in Camp Duke, 6'2", Eyes of Blue when it comes to my favorite G.I. Joe leaders. But even I can't deny how awesome Flint's voice is. That charismatic, confident, and commanding tone, sometimes even bordering on arrogant, perfectly fits the character. Or for my Filipino viewers, sorry for being a little crass, but that laglag banty type of voice. All thanks to the man behind it, Bill Ratner. Seriously, if you ask me, it's right up there with other iconic Joe voices like Cobra Commander and Duke, voiced by the legendary Chris Latta and Michael Bell, respectively. And speaking of those two, I always found it funny that the top dogs of G.I. Joe were also the same voices behind the second-in-command dudes over in Transformers, Starscream and Prowl. Also, another funny bit is that while Duke originally starts the miniseries intros with the Yo Joe battle cry, Flint takes over that role in the regular series intros, but the voice remains as Duke because, I don't know, money saver? But I digress. Unlike those two voice legends who left their mark across both franchises, Flint's voice is purely G.I. Joe. Bill Ratner's only Transformers credit is when he returned to voice the previously mentioned Daddy Flint. Speaking of which, Flint would make his grand debut in the G.I. Joe comics by Marvel in issue number 37, where he shows the Crimson Twin Xamot exactly who his daddy was by pummeling him on top of a roller coaster track. That same issue also marks the first meeting between Flint and Lady J, where Flint proudly proclaims that he's there to class up her act. Yeah, let's just say that first impression didn't exactly sweep her off her feet. What did impress her came a few issues later in issue number 53, when Flint single-handedly took on an entire battalion of Cobra Eels so that Lady J could escape and warn the rest of the Joes about a surprise attack on the G.I. Joe headquarters. He was seriously injured and nearly executed in the process, but that act of bravery definitely earned him some serious points with Lady J, and well, a definite lug-lug. Okay, I'll stop there. From that moment on, her perception of Flint shifted from an arrogant field leader to a man she could trust, respect, and fight beside. And as I said, their partnership would grow into one of the Joe franchise's strongest and most believable romantic arcs. I mean, if your partner could do this, you'd probably stay in line too. Just kidding. That punch came during a tense moment in a storyline where Snake Eyes and Scarlet, during what was supposed to be a double-date vacation with Flint and Lady J, faked their own deaths to carry out a secret mission to rescue fellow Joes from a Barovian gulag. Obviously butthurt over the deception, Flint angrily confronts the two when they resurface, prompting Lady J to literally knock back some sense into him. It was a rare emotional lapse for the usually composed Flint, but also a reminder of how grounded their relationship was. Lady J kept Flint human, and she kept him balanced. Unfortunately, she wouldn't be there forever. Years after the original Marvel series ended, a new publisher, Devil's Due, set out to continue the Joe's story. Their series picked up as a direct sequel to the Marvel run, set years after Cobra had been defeated and the Joe team had been decommissioned. By this time, Flint and Lady J had settled down and gotten married. Flint, now older and more mellow, spent most of his days writing his memoirs, chronicling his life with G.I. Joe. But when Cobra inevitably comes back, the Joes are reinstated with both Flint and Lady J being called back to active duty, and it is in the line of duty that Lady J, the center of Flint's universe, unfortunately, falls. Lady J is killed, murdered before Flint's eyes by the Red Shadow agent Della Eden, and the loss shatters him. Consumed by grief and rage, Flint goes rogue, tracking the Red Shadows across the globe until he finally confronts Della Eden in their stronghold. When the moment came, he had the chance to kill her, but he didn't. Even at his lowest moment, Lady J's influence still guided him. His moral compass, though cracked, hadn't broken. Still, Flint was a completely changed man. The once articulate, confident officer had become grim, silent, and emotionally scarred, both literally and figuratively. His trademark grin was gone, replaced by a haunted expression and the battle scars of someone who'd lost more than most could bear. He advocated overwhelming force, distanced himself from the team, and buried his pain beneath relentless training and vengeance. In the end, it was Lady J's lasting presence, her memory, and her influence that pulled him back from the brink. Flint slowly found his footing again, overcoming his anger and grief to return to the Joes, where he played a key role in the climactic series-ending event, World War III. Not long after that, the G.I. Joe license moved to IDW, and in a complete boss, or if you're Devil's Due, dick move, they brought back the legendary Larry Hama, the original writer of the classic Marvel run, to continue his version of the story, effectively rendering all of Devil's Due's continuity non-canon. And while that sucked for Devil's Due, whose take on the Joes I genuinely think was pretty good. It was actually great news for Flint because in Hama's world, Lady J never died. Now, to be honest, as far as I know, in Hama's continued series for IDW, Flint and Lady J didn't really play major roles in any of the key arcs. Sorry, please do let me know if I missed something though. As Hama was a little busy resurrecting Serpentor and killing him off again, along with Snake Eyes, replacing him with not one but two successors, and then, in true comic book fashion, bringing the original guy back with a pristine face and the power of speech. Wait, what? Snake Eyes can talk now? Yeah, just check out my story on Snake Eyes for more deets on that. I'll place a link in the description below. And speaking of descriptions, how would you like to be described as that person wearing a really awesome G.I. Joe t-shirt? In case you haven't noticed, YouTube has been giving content creators like myself the ability to tag related products on our videos for all of you. So if you want a shirt with Flint's classic artwork plastered on the front or any other Joe related stuff, why not try out my linked items on this video and get yourself some cool merch and help me out as well. My channel ends up getting a little extra income and you end up looking really cool. It's a win-win for everybody. Anyway, over in IDW's own separate G.I. Joe universe, Flint was much more of an active player. This version of the Joes was a little more grounded, more real-world, more modern, but still stayed pretty faithful to what we knew from Flint's file card and earlier portrayals. Well, aside from one random tweak that, if I'm honest, felt kinda unnecessary. In this continuity, Flint's backstory is fleshed out a little more. From a young age, he was the picture of responsibility, caring for his alcoholic mother, putting everyone else's needs above his own, and burying his grief in study and discipline. Growing up in Kansas and eventually still becoming a Rhodes Scholar, Flint made something of himself through sheer drive and intellect. Then comes the tweak. In college, Flint had a girlfriend named Claire Austin, who left him, but not knowing she was pregnant with his daughter. You guessed it, Marissa Fairborn. Now look, personally, I've always preferred the idea that Lady J is Marissa's mom, but I get what IDW was going for here. Making Marissa the child of an estranged, broken relationship gives the two a lot more emotional friction. You couldn't really pull that off if her parents were Flint and Lady J, arguably the most stable couple in G.I. Joe's history. So, ex-college sweetheart, it is. But what really sets IDW's Flint apart from his previous incarnations isn't just the family drama. It's how that relationship pulls him into something much bigger. Because this version of Marissa also works closely with the Transformers as part of the EDC as well. And let's just say she's got a strangely close working relationship with a certain former Decepticon turned aspiring screenwriter, Thundercracker. That's right, Flint, father-in-law to a Seeker. Who would have thought? I'm just kidding. They didn't get married. But let me tell you, putting aside all the physical details on how such a relationship would actually work, there seems to be a whole lot of Thunder Rissa shippers out there. I'm just saying, if Brawn and CoverGirl could do it... Okay, sorry, I know, off tangent. So yeah, thanks to his connection to Marissa, Flint ends up front and center as both a G.I. Joe operative and a representative of Earth in IDW's shared G.I. Joe Transformers continuity. He becomes part of a human Cybertronian coalition managing alien relations and galactic politics, with missions ranging from helping establish a new home on Earth for the Junkions called Little Cybertron, to the defense of Earth's induction into the Council of Worlds. And through all the chaos, Flint makes it all the way to the arrival of the Chaos Bringer himself, Unicron, and ultimately, while protecting the President of the United States, survives, thanks to the help of the Junkions, because apparently it pays to oversee the construction of a new home for displaced Cybertronians. Now, speaking of survival, given Flint's long-standing status as one of G.I. Joe's no-nonsense alpha dudes, you know, the kind of guy who could easily put a certain non-deodorant-using masked ranger in his place, it's no surprise that he's managed to stick around and appear in just about every major adaptation of the franchise, or at least the ones I feel are worth talking about. From the gritty, hard-edged G.I. Joe Resolute, to the reimagined on-the-run tone of G.I. Joe Renegades, and even his big screen debut in G.I. Joe Retaliation, Flint has continued to be present with almost every new take on the Joe universe. First up, G.I. Joe Resolute, where Flint takes on more of a background role. He's present, he's competent, and he's part of the final assault against Cobra in Springfield. And that's pretty much it. No major spotlight, no memorable lines, but hey, at least he didn't die, which already puts him ahead of poor Bazooka and Major Blood. He gets a much bigger spotlight in G.I. Joe Renegades, which reimagines the Joes before they were officially G.I. Joe. The show follows a small band of fugitives, Duke, Scarlet, Snake Eyes, and company, on the run from both Cobra and, ironically, the US military itself, led by none other than Flint. In this version, Flint's been reinterpreted as a first lieutenant in Army intelligence, more bureaucrat than commando. He serves as a determined antagonist chasing the Renegades after the destruction of Cobra Pharmaceuticals. His connection to Duke runs deep, with flashbacks hinting at a shared football past and a mix of rivalry and mutual respect. While Flint comes off as overbearing and by the book, his integrity still shows through. He protects the Renegades' families, refuses to pull the trigger when he's got a clean shot at Duke, and even teams up with them when Cobra becomes the bigger threat. He's also joined by Lady J, whose loyalties are, let's say, complicated. Officially, she's on Flint's side, but unofficially, she's helping Duke and the Renegades slip through his fingers every chance she gets. Then we get to the live-action movie G.I. Joe Retaliation, where we meet a much younger Flint, played by actor DJ Cotrona. This version joins the team right before most of them are wiped out in a surprise Cobra airstrike, orchestrated by Zartan posing as the US president. Flint, of course, survives and joins Roadblock, the new team leader, to, well, retaliate. Honestly, there's not a whole lot to say about this version either. He doesn't even wear his signature beret at all. I guess he looks the part, though, of a generic young rookie soldier, which, really fits Flint's character to a T. But ultimately, he doesn't get to do much. In fact, you could have swapped him out for, Chuckles, and I doubt anybody would have noticed. With that being said, I'm pretty sure what most of you awesome viewers would notice is if I ended this video right here, right now, without talking about the toys. So let's get to them, shall we? The very first Flint figure was released in 1985 as part of the fourth wave of Joes. His codename, Flint, is often believed to be a nod to writer Flint Dille, who worked on both the G.I. Joe and Transformers animated series back in the 80s. But the name also fits for another reason. Like the actual rock, Flint is hard and durable, able to take pressure without breaking. But when struck the right way, he can splinter into razor-sharp edges, the kinds early humans used to make weapons and cutting tools. He can even produce sparks to start fires when hit against steel. Tough, sharp, dependable, and capable of igniting action when things heat up. A perfect description for Flint the Joe, if you ask me. Flint's real name, Dashiell R. Fairborn, was originally planned as Dashiell Fairbairn, a clever nod to both Dashiell Hammett, author of the Maltese Falcon, and William Ewart Fairbairn, the co-inventor of the Fairbairn-Sykes fighting knife. Anyway, Flint's original figure definitely stood out with his trademark beret, a look we hadn't seen since the original Ranger Stalker, and despite pretty basic face sculpts back in the day, his smug, confident grin. But what really caught my attention as a kid, though, was his weapon of choice. I wasn't exactly an expert on firearms at the time, so Flint's shotgun looked, a little underwhelming. To me, it resembled less a weapon and more of a fold-up umbrella. Still, between his cool, no-nonsense uniform with bullets streaming down each side and the effortless swagger displayed on his face, Flint quickly became one of my favorites. That original design was strong enough to stand the test of time, getting a Tiger Force repaint in 1988 before Flint received his first major redesign in 1991, when he traded in his traditional military look for something a little more neon, and his trusty shotgun for a water-squirting one as the commander of the Joe's new anti-pollution squad, the Eco Warriors. And before the Real American Hero line wrapped up in 1994, we'd see a little dialed-back version of Flint with some questionable headgear, one last time as part of the Battle Corps subline. What's worth mentioning, though, is that had the line continued, there were plans and even prototypes for one more figure of Flint, as a ninja, or to be more specific, the original Ninja Commando, well before Roadblock came into the picture. Yeah, let's just say it's probably for the best that that one stayed in the dojo. Flint returned in a big way as part of the 25th anniversary line that saw a plethora of modern versions of our favorite warrant officer. Vintage Look, Tiger Force, Cobra Disguise, Resolute, DJ Cotrona, and even Eco Warrior Flint as part of an exclusive 2014 International G.I. Joe Convention Zombie Initiative box set. And finally, in 2022, Flint hit the big time with a larger 6-inch figure in the G.I. Joe classified line, sporting a modern look that wasn't too much of a departure from the classic one. A year later, this guy was naturally repainted in Tiger Force colors with the extra touch of some camo on his face. Definitely going against tradition there. But for sticklers of tradition, a retro-carded Flint that was slavish to the OG figure was finally released in 2025, which is pretty cool. But to be honest, I kinda prefer the modern take a little bit more. The retro's face just seems a little bit odd. But as excellent as those classified versions of Flint were, what all of them failed to satisfy would be those who wanted a tune-accurate warrant officer. Something that Super 7 came so close to giving us with their Ultimates version in 2023. I mean, look at these renders. They look amazing. Unfortunately, they kinda cheaped out on the final product, looking to save a little moolah by not painting his face and thinking we wouldn't care. But I mean, that plastic sheen on his face just really ruined the figure for me, and no amount of extra hands, weapons, or shovel could make up for this. The fourth wave of G.I. Joe action figures released in 1986 will always be, for me, a sorta refresh for the toy line. While we got some Joes with new and unique specialties like the Night Spotter Lowlight and Computer Specialist Mainframe, the majority of new recruits were basically refreshes of designations held by Joes from the previous years. Case in point, we got a new Snow Trooper, Laser Trooper, Communications Specialist, Marine, SEAL, and a brand new Ranger. Now, while I was excited to be introduced to all these new and colorful Joes, it was the Ranger Beachhead that I immediately gravitated to from the start for one simple reason. He wore a mask that to an 8-year-old like me made him instantly better than Ezra. I mean, the rest. There was just something extra special about a character with a concealed face. You get that sense of mystery and added intimidation factor because I know it was the 80s, well before the technology of face printing, but a lot of those early unmasked faces were pretty bleh. Anyway, I remember Marvel's G.I. Joe issue number 47, which served as Beachhead's and fellow 86er Wetsuit's official introduction into the Joe world. I still remember the cover being one of my favorites with an intense-looking Beachhead piloting an equally new Devilfish attack boat with Wetsuit and General Hawk on each side firing holy hell at the enemy. Basically mirroring the Devilfish box art sans Hawk, that is. Talk about expert cross-promotion synergy. It was an epic issue featuring an exciting showdown between Beachhead and company battling Dr. Mindbender and his new water torpedo transports, the Hydro Sleds. Throw in a classic Cobra hydrofoil hijacked by a couple of ninjas, and you've got one hell of a sea duel. In the end, Beachhead and company managed to rescue Snake Eyes from a bloody shark feeding frenzy, and a battle-worn Storm Shadow miraculously makes it to shore just in time to be, spoiler, gunned down by the Baroness. Don't worry, kiddies. We all know ninjas named Storm Shadow don't die. Another story for another time. So as cool as Beachhead looked in that one issue, I actually remember being a bit let down the first time I laid eyes on his toy. I remember it clearly. I was a kid in judo class when one of my classmates came excitedly running in holding a brand new Devilfish in hand, and on it was a good number of 86 Joes, including Beachhead. Lucky bastard. Anyway, like I said, there was just something about the shape of his head being a bit too wide or square. I don't know, he just looked less intimidating. But don't get me wrong, overall, I still found the character cool, and seeing my friend holding him along with all the other brand new Joes filled me with so much envy. I was just so tempted to just judo flip him onto the mat and wipe that grin off his face. In the end though, I eventually did get my hands on my very own Beachhead, so it's all good. Now, Beachhead was the new Ranger on the block. Don't worry, Stalker fans, the OG Ranger would eventually make his triumphant return a few years later. Anyway, as per his file card, Beachhead's real name is Wayne R. Sneeden. something I'll touch upon later on in the episode. And he hails from the state of Alabama. Now, I hope you don't mind a quick side story. As a kid from the Philippines, I didn't really know much about US states aside from, San Francisco, New York, Los Angeles. But I do remember the name Alabama making quite the impression on me. And not because of the Lynyrd Skynyrd song Sweet Home Alabama, but because I had another classmate who was obsessed with the movie Full Metal Jacket, and who would frequently quote his favorite line about a magnificent specimen of a pure Alabama black snake. If you know, you know. But back to the file card. Wayne is characterized as a meticulous, patient, and strong-willed individual. You know, the type who routinely gets up in the morning way before everyone else just to take a 10-mile run before breakfast. Beachhead enjoys squatting motionless beside a jungle trail for 3 days straight, waiting to ambush bad guys that might never show up. Speaking of which, Ambush was actually one of Beachhead's working names along with Mr. Bones and, well, Cool. Not because he walked around in sunglasses or anything, but because his flavored text at the end of his file card paints Beachhead as a guy who never gets mad or irritable, as he basically thinks that getting angry is a waste of time and energy. As he sees it, rage clouds the vision and pollutes logic. Fury impairs judgment and makes one careless, which is totally unacceptable to Beachhead. He doesn't get angry, he gets even. So yeah, I think it's a fair assumption to say that Beachhead was a pretty intense individual, which is what I think was one of the main reasons, aside from his look, that made Beachhead an easy fan favorite. What didn't win him any fans though was his lack of interest with personal hygiene. Deodorant is a big no-no for Beachhead. I mean, you can't successfully ambush the enemy in a jungle smelling like Old Spice, can you? His unique, beachy scent was also humorously pointed out by fellow Joe Mainframe, who had the unfortunate honor of being trapped in the coffin of Vlad the Impaler with Beachhead for 18 hours straight in the cartoon miniseries Arise Serpentor Arise. And speaking of the original cartoon, it seems like the writers forgot to do their proper homework, as the animated Beachhead felt like a completely different person from what was described in his file card. While things start off pretty similar enough, with Beachhead being a ranger school lane instructor on his file card and a drill instructor in the cartoon, it diverges pretty quickly from there. Right from the start, Beachhead is identified as one of the top-ranking Joes on the team, which I guess isn't too much of a stretch, given that the OG Ranger Stalker served as the field leader of the team in the early years, before Duke came into the picture. But where Beachhead really differs is in his personality. Whereas the file card had him as a patient individual who never got angry, the cartoon portrayed him as a rather abrasive, irritable, and impatient dude who was easily angered and frustrated. Case in point, back to Arise Serpentor Arise. While overseeing a Joe training session, Beachhead gripes about how the Joe top brass have gotten soft and things would be so much different with him in charge, but is immediately put in his place by Warrant Officer Flint, who flat out states the G.I. Joe pecking order: Hawk, Duke, Flint, and then Beachhead. Which, to be fair, top 4 ain't that bad. But yeah, apparently he sorta had a bit of a rivalry with Flint, especially since he disapproved of Flint's relationship with Lady J. Nothing personal, Beachhead wasn't a big fan of Duke and Scarlet either, as he saw romance between Joes as being against regulations. Anyway, all that aside, Beachhead responds to Flint's comment with a, "Yeah? Well, maybe that will change someday." And almost immediately, the new drill instructor Sergeant Slaughter is introduced, who would arguably knock Beachhead down another level on the proverbial leadership totem pole. Definitely not the outcome Beachhead was hoping for. And speaking of unfavorable outcomes, in the episode The Most Dangerous Thing in the World, when Cobra deviously sends false orders to Joe headquarters, promoting unlikely Joe's dial tone, lifeline, and shipwreck to the rank of colonel, an exasperated Beachhead openly wonders, why not me? But I believe that Beachhead's most famous role in the cartoons was in the 1987 movie, when he welcomed new Joe recruits Law, Tunnel Rat, Big Lob, Chuckles, and Jinx, whom he collectively dubbed as the Rawhides, and oversaw their training exercises as their no-nonsense drill instructor. It's a really memorable sequence as the rawhides and their unique qualities and skills are introduced, unfortunately at the expense of Beachhead, who goes bananas at being unable to stop Tunnel Rat and Big Lob from ringing his bell, is forced to play an explosive game of fetch with Lost Dog Order, gets unceremoniously thrown off a Havoc canopy by Chuckles, and finally has his ass convincingly handed to him by a blindfolded Jinx. Still, I'd argue that despite all that, Beachhead does get away with one of the funniest lines in the movie when he frustratingly wishes that Law and Order both get fleas. Anyways, speaking of introductions, while initially Beachhead was no different from most of the new characters in the cartoons and comics, in the fact that he basically just appeared out of nowhere, in modern times, publisher IDW actually took the trouble to give a proper backstory to Beachhead and how he was recruited into the Joe team. And it's a pretty cool story as told in the 11th issue of their G.I. Joe Origins series. But before we get into that, I was hoping I could head you off into the direction of helping me out with my channel. As always, a like, comment, or a sub would be very much appreciated. But if clicks are not your cup of tea, I hope at least you'd consider sharing this story or any other story from my channel to at least one of your close compadres. You know, someone you wouldn't mind spending a day at the beach with. Okay, I'll stop. Ultimately, any way you choose to help out will be very much appreciated, so thank you. Now back to the story. So it starts out with a lone, injured, unconscious soldier found washed up on the shore of the Rio Dulce in Guatemala. He's taken to the local hospital where he wakes up with no memory of who he is and how he got there. And hearing that he speaks English, the staff enlists the help of an American doctor named Dr. Anderson, who helps him partially regain his memory by showing him his recovered bloodied uniform. Almost immediately, he remembers himself being an American soldier, an Army Ranger to be exact, who was leading a team on a recon mission to scope out an up-and-coming drug lord named Montenegro in the jungles of Guatemala. On their way to their assigned location, they come across a local village who houses them and offers them food. Unfortunately, within the village, there are Montenegro sympathizers who report the Ranger's presence in their village to the drug lord. When the soldier learns of this, he orders his team to leave the village in order to spare the villagers, but comes to the conclusion that despite their departure, the villagers would still be gunned down anyway by Montenegro's men for helping the Americans. So the soldier makes the decision to stay behind and single-handedly take on the drug lord's men to allow his team and the innocent villagers to escape, knowing full well that he will most likely not survive. The soldier simply spouts off a phrase that pretty much defines his character to a T, as he remains behind to embrace the suck. Anyway, while initially putting up a commendable fight, taking out a good number of Montenegro's men, he is eventually shot and falls down a cliff into the Rio Dulce down below, which brings us to the opening scene where he is discovered washed up on the shore. In the end, the doctor reveals himself to be none other than Duke and informs the soldier of his true identity as Wayne Sneeden, Sergeant and Army Ranger. Now, who did not see that coming? Anyway, Duke informs him that he has been listed as killed in action, which makes Wayne the perfect recruit to be part of an elite organization dedicated to battling the most extreme international threats around the globe. You know, G.I. Joe. And after a little bit of convincing, the soldier accepts on the condition that Duke and his team help him take down Montenegro and his men for good. Anyway, the issue ends with the soldier finally getting his official code name, and despite his wanting to go with something like Night Ranger or Wolfman, Duke gives him the name that the Guatemalan hospital staff identified him by, due to where he was initially found, Cabeza de Playa, Beachhead. It was a real cool story giving a proper introduction to the Joe Ranger, and it's also noteworthy for prominently featuring what Beachhead actually looked like, you know, without the mask. And speaking of which, this actually wasn't the only time Beachhead has been shown without his signature green balaclava. In fact, there have been a good number of instances across different media where we get to see the actual face behind the mask, but funnily enough, what he looks like actually differs almost every single time. In the original cartoon, his face has been randomly revealed, most likely owing to animation errors. But for what it's worth, his cartoon face is clearly shown in his design from what I assume is the cartoon reference sheet. In the comics, Beachhead is shown arm wrestling the Marine Leatherneck during some downtime at the pit, sans his mask, sporting some generic brown hair. In a later issue that is titled Unmasking, teasing the face reveals of famously masked characters like Snake Eyes, Cobra Commander, and Destro, it is actually only Beachhead who is fully shown unmasked, now with white hair. But let's chalk that up to the artist forgetting to color it in, given that he was just in the background. Interestingly, a couple of bigger plastic renditions of Beachhead feature an unmasked head as well, with the first released in 2002 as part of the G.I. Joe vs. Cobra line, which I'm assuming featured modern G.I. Joe characters done in the original 60s Joe style. And as such, his toy had a pretty generic, clean-cut face. A much more interesting take would be the realistic offering from Sideshow Collectibles in 2011. Now, this guy's alternate unmasked face is how I envisioned the ideal Beachhead to be. Very mean-looking mug topped off with a very close-cropped buzz cut. Actually kinda reminds me of Jason Statham a bit. But as cool as this version was, 1/6 scale action figures aren't really my jam. So let's get talking about stuff that I do collect, starting with the traditional 1/18th scale of the Real American Hero line. I already mentioned the original Beachhead figure, which was really the only one I had as a kid. But before the initial toy line run ended, Hasbro released a newly designed Battlecore Beachhead figure, this time with shades. Okay, goggles, to completely cover up his face. But by that time I was done collecting as a kid, so I never got it. On a side note, this new figure was re-released in Brazil as a Cobra character named Armadillo. And on a side note, even if I never had this figure, I did make a custom of it in the later 25th anniversary line, which served as my re-entry into collecting G.I. Joes as an adult. And the 25th anniversary Beachhead was literally one of the first figures that I bought that sent me down that modern G.I. Joe collecting rabbit hole. It's worth noting that the first 25th anniversary Beachhead wasn't exactly a straight-up update of the original figure, but instead was seemingly based on a later version of Beachhead released in 2002. While fairly similar, it did have some distinct differences from the original, including an open vest and a paler shade of green. Eventually though, we did get a straight-up update of his original figure that came packed in with his coffin mate mainframe. And an interesting addition to this set was an alternate unmasked head for Beachhead with yet another look, this time sporting a kinda Fu Manchu mustache. We also got another variant figure based off his more basic and streamlined look from the animated micro-series G.I. Joe Resolute, wherein Beachhead teamed up with his fellow ranger Stalker to rescue some scientists held hostage by Destro and the Baroness, practicing the clarinet. Sorry, couldn't resist. Anyway, if you want my favorite 1/18th scaled version of Beachhead, it would hands down be the one that we got in 2010 as part of the awesome Pursuit of Cobra line. It's the perfect combination of the classic design with a ton of modern flair. In fact, I even go as far as to say that, OG version aside, this is the best look Beachhead has had in any scale. But we're not done yet, as the two most recent versions of Beachhead released were part of the G.I. Joe Classified line, which featured figures in the larger 1/12th scale. The first one came out early on when Hasbro was still waffling between a more futuristic or classical aesthetic to the line. So as a result, this first Beachhead was a bit of a hybrid, actually leaning closer to the previously mentioned 2002 version. This figure had the unfortunate combination of being a Target exclusive that was released around 2020 during the pandemic, which made it one of the harder figures to find and thus fetching a very high secondary market price. Fortunately, at the time I was not yet collecting classified, and so I didn't lose sleep trying to track this guy down. When I did start, Hasbro was in full swing with their classified retro subline featuring pretty much straight up updates of the OG figures down to the oversized card back packaging. And that's where I got my classified version of Beachhead. Two of them actually. See, given how highly sought after the previous Beachhead was, I wasted no time in pre-ordering this new Beachhead on Amazon, but when he was released earlier in Singapore, I had my friend who was conveniently coming over to Manila for a visit pick one up for me with the full intention of canceling my original pre-order when I had the actual Beachhead figure in hand from my friend. Unfortunately though, even if he did buy it for me, he accidentally left it behind in Singapore, and not long after, my Amazon Beachhead was shipped. At first, I was fine since I figured that selling off my extra Beachhead would be easy, but I guess Hasbro learned their lesson from the first release, and this new one was everywhere. So needless to say, if anyone wants a retro Beachhead, I've got a pristine unopened one for sale. Regardless, at least now, I can check off Beachhead from my classified wishlist. But speaking of checks, did you know that Beachhead actually had a connection to another late 80s animated cartoon show, Cops? Set in the near future, the show features a character who hails from Alabama and had a father who was a member of a top-secret military team in the 80s and 90s. His name was Checkpoint. Well, his code name was Checkpoint. His real name was Wayne Sneeden III. Sound familiar? So I guess old Beachhead eventually did get struck by Cupid's arrow and find romance after all. And he had a son who grew up to follow in his footsteps and joined the army as a military police officer. Much like one of his old man's former rawhide trainees, the G.I. Joe MP, Law. Lonzo R. Wilkinson, codenamed Stalker, was part of the first wave of Joes released in 1982, lovingly referred to by many fans as the original 13. And going over the roster of these real American heroes, it was quite apparent that Stalker pretty much stood apart from all the rest. I mean, aside from the completely black-clad Snake Eyes and the obviously female Scarlet, while the rest of the team sported solid green uniforms and standard issue helmets, Stalker's distinctly camouflaged duds and beret definitely set him apart from his teammates. Oh yeah, and he was also African American. But despite being the minority, or more specifically the only African American on the team, Stalker was far from the token black guy. That was Snake Eyes. Sorry, couldn't help it. See, that was the beauty of this first offering of Joes. Actually, the entire line moving forward. From the very beginning, it was never really about race. Stuff like that didn't really matter to a 6-year-old like me. What I cared about was that he looked cool. Anyway, with all that aside, Stalker's official designation was a Ranger. The Green Ranger, to be exact. Just kidding. Sorry, I'll stop. So, Stalker was a Ranger, which is defined in the military sense as a soldier specifically trained to act in small groups that make rapid surprise raids on enemy territory, as well as involved in special ops missions of recovering stolen picnic baskets from thieving bears. And just to address the elephant in the room, he did not get his codename Stalker because he liked to pursue others obsessively and aggressively to the point of harassment. Stalker was given his codename due to his exceptional skills as a recon specialist. Again, in the military sense, a stalker is one who can move stealthily and observe the enemy without being detected and gather intelligence. So yeah, with that settled, let's move on, shall we? Very early on in the original Marvel comics, well before Duke came into the picture, Stalker was the field leader of the G.I. Joe team, and for good reason, as he was the first to be recruited into the team by the then Colonel Hawk, and together would go on to recruit the rest of the original 13, the first of which would be Stalker's old friend, Snake Eyes. But we're getting way ahead of ourselves, as a huge part of Stalker's story starts well before G.I. Joe, well before meeting Hawk, and well before he even met Snake Eyes. I promise we'll get to all that in due time. But first, let's start at the beginning, in Detroit, Michigan, where a young Lonzo grew up in the meanest sections of the city. It was here where he first learned to fight and fend for himself. In fact, it was in this situation of excessive violence that Lonzo thrived as he eventually became the warlord of a large street gang. Unfortunately, though, that same world of violence would take the lives of his two older brothers. Seeing how their deaths tore his mother apart served as a wake-up call for Lonzo, and he sought to remove himself from the vicious cycle of gang life, and he saw joining the military as the best way to do this. Talk about jumping out of the frying pan and into the fire. Anyway, after training, Stalker was eventually deployed to Vietnam. And as a side note, to spare his mom from the knowledge that her son was going to a full-blown war zone, he told her that he was stationed in Germany instead, where he had his mail rerouted to him through a cousin living there. So while his mom thought he was out touring Germany and sampling the local beers, Stalker was actually out on another tour deep in the jungles of Vietnam as part of a special 6-man long-range recon patrol behind enemy lines. Along with Stalker was the quiet and even then mysterious Snake Eyes, and Tommy Storm's Shadow Arashikage. And rounding up the team would be fellow soldiers Wade Collins, Ramon Escobedo, and Dick Saperstein. And if none of those guys' names ring a bell, well, I guess you know that there's a pretty good reason why. 6 months into their tour, the group stumbles upon an encampment of North Vietnamese soldiers, which leads to an immediate firefight. And while initially taken by surprise, the Vietnamese soldiers quickly gain the upper hand. First to be taken down are Collins and Escobedo, the latter basically getting most of his face blown off. Saperstein attempts to outflank the enemy but unfortunately steps on a landmine, instantly ending him, leaving Stalker, Storm Shadow, and Snake Eyes barely managing to reach their extraction chopper. After the war, the three survivors continued on with their lives, with Storm Shadow returning to Japan. He was joined by Snake Eyes, who found out that his own family had been tragically killed in a car wreck on their way to pick him up. And as for Stalker, he remained in the military and was assigned to a peacekeeping mission in Barovia under the command of a then Lieutenant Colonel Clayton Hawk Abernathy. It was during this mission that Stalker's men discovered explosives in a refugee camp that would have killed a number of children if they had gone off. Stalker knew their options and time were limited, and so he resorted to physically beating a captured terrorist to force him to reveal the locations of the explosives, which he did. And while the information that Stalker obtained saved a good number of innocent lives, the means of how he acquired it gained the ire of the Major General who Hawk reported to. But despite everything, Hawk refused to give up Stalker, as while he deemed Stalker's actions wrong, he himself acknowledged that given the same choice, he would have done the same thing. Hawk blamed the higher-ups in the chain of command as those ultimately responsible, and he wanted to see who of them would be willing to accept it. In the end, the buck stopped with Hawk, who was given a court-martial over the incident. But more importantly though, Hawk's principled stand greatly impressed another general, General Lawrence J. Flagg, who had the charges on Hawk dropped and recruited him to form the G.I. Joe team with Stalker as his first recruit, which basically brings us up to speed with Stalker's story. Sorta. See, another interesting twist to Stalker, Snake Eyes, and Storm Shadow's shared past in Vietnam was that apparently they weren't the only survivors on their ill-fated squad. Wade Collins, against all odds, survived the conflict as well and was taken in as a prisoner of war for 2 years. Eventually, though, he returned to America at the end of the war and due to unfortunate circumstances ended up getting recruited into Cobra as a Crimson Guard. Now, for those not in the know, the Crimson Guard were the elite of the elite in the Cobra ranks. They were so highly regarded that they were not wasted on the battlefield and instead operated as sleeper agents infiltrating communities and governments as highly trained professionals. Lawyers, accountants, doctors. Yeah, I know that doesn't sound very cool, but I guess the point was that they were everywhere without you knowing it. Anyway, their cover was so deep that the Crimson Guard would undergo facial reconstructive surgery to make them all look alike. And they were all named Fred. That way, for whatever reason, a Crimson Guard agent could be replaced on the fly with another one without skipping a beat should the previous one, die. And so Wade Collins, now named Fred, took residence in Staten Island to take his place as the head of the Broca family. Broca. What an interesting name. If I didn't know any better, that would look like a pretty good anagram for Cobra. Man, that's high-level infiltration protocol right there. And so the story goes, Fred Broca eventually tracks down and confronts his former friends, Stalker and Snake Eyes, and reveals his true identity to them as their long-thought-dead comrade, Wade Collins. Anyway, Stalker, because Snake Eyes can't talk, manages to convince Wade that he was being used by Cobra, and so he decides to leave the organization and start a new life, thankfully with his adopted family in tow, who choose to go with him. And just as another aside, Wade Collins' adopted son, Sean, eventually grows up to join G.I. Joe himself as the ninja apprentice of Snake Eyes, codenamed Kamakura. Well, did we go off on a tangent or what? Sorry about that. I just love how writer Larry Hama weaved the histories of many of his main Joe characters in a relatively organic and believable way. I mean, at least he didn't go overboard and turn Duke and the Baroness into former lovers, with her brother and Duke's best friend eventually turning into Cobra Commander. I mean, who in their right mind would ever do something like... Oh, okay, never mind. Anyway, before we get back on course, I figure that this is as good a time as any to ask for your help by leaving a like or comment for this video. Or if you still haven't yet, sub to my channel. Or if you would like to go the extra mile, why not try out being a friend of the Toy Shelf for even more exclusive goodies? All you gotta do is just click the join button on my channel's homepage. So don't be a stalker, say hello, and stick around. But either way, thank you for your support. It is very much appreciated. So back to stalking. Stalker. Like I said, Stalker was one of the first Joes to stand out way back in '82 with his camouflage deco, snazzy beret, and M32 pulverizer submachine gun. He also featured quite prominently in the first cartoon miniseries, but after that, he kind of faded quietly into the background as newer Joes were added to the team year after year, including a new Ranger in 1986, Beachhead, But despite seemingly being replaced, it wasn't long until Stalker was back with a new figure in 1989, this time as a Tundra Ranger. This new version still sported his signature camo pattern, just with some added winter gear and a more snug beanie in place of his signature beret, ready to do battle in the snow. I guess this was done to differentiate him more from Beachhead, who despite having a penchant of not using deodorant, had himself become very popular with the fans as well. This new Stalker came fully equipped with a machine gun mounted kayak. Talk about a major upgrade, and was surprisingly featured in the 1989 miniseries Operation Dragonfire. But to be honest, the less said about that series, the better. Over the next few years, we would get a couple more unique versions of Stalker before the Real American Hero line would eventually come to an end in the mid-90s. First up would be the Talking Battle Commander Stalker in 1992. And as the name suggests, this Stalker came with a ginormous backpack. Is that a shuriken? Must be from his buddy Snake Eye. Sorry. Ginormous backpack that was in reality a little electronic device that played a bunch of pre-recorded lines. So this Stalker could charge into battle spouting out phrases like, somehow that last one kind of feels off for Stalker, but whatever. Hasbro didn't think so. As with the next Stalker in 1994, Battle Core Stalker, "Let's Party" is specifically stated in his file card as his main catchphrase. So yeah, party on, dudes. Oh, and while this isn't Stalker per se, I thought it would be worth mentioning that for their own international version of G.I. Joe, Argentinian company Plastorama also released the original Stalker toy as a new character, the paratrooper Manle, or is it Manly? Whatever, giving him a predominantly blue color scheme based on the Argentinian flag and adding more facial hair and a lighter complexion. Anyway, since then, Stalker has remained a constant presence in almost all modern iterations of the toy line. The 25th anniversary gave us Stalker in his traditional camo, a darker camo, and a lighter tune-inspired camo. And although he didn't play a major role in the excellent micro-series G.I. Joe Resolute in 2009, Stalker was there, infiltrating a Cobra-held facility with fellow Ranger Beachhead and rescued hostages, which was enough to give him another figure, this time with some cool dreads. The final 1/18th scale Stalker was released as part of the 30th anniversary in 2011. This Stalker was a nice mix of the original vintage figure with some really cool modern updates. Dreads. And speaking of modern updates, we've got two more Stalkers to cover in the larger 1/12th scale. First up is the G.I. Joe Classified version released in 2022. Again, this is more of a realistic real-world take on Stalker, which for the most part, I'm pretty happy with. I don't know, not a big fan of the face sculpt. It just feels too old and grizzled. Yes, I get it, Stalker is old. I mean, he was part of the original 13, but yeah, it doesn't quite do it for me. I wonder if there's any other possible head swaps for this guy. If you got any suggestions, let me know in the comments down below. But anyway, for those who prefer a Stalker even closer to the original look, Hasbro's got your back as well with a retro-styled repaint of this guy out this year. But for me, I'm quite happy with what I have, especially when it comes to the last Stalker in my collection. While I admit Stalker really wasn't much of a factor after the first G.I. Joe miniseries, he was a big enough deal to merit a much coveted spot in the very limited Super 7's Ultimates G.I. Joe line, which was completely based on the cartoon. And while it took some time, I finally got my animated Stalker this year, and he's great. As per usual with the Ultimates line, aside from looking like he stepped right out of the TV screen, he comes with a good number of accessories from the cartoon. My favorites being the jetpack that he was often depicted using, as well as a dynamite bomb that he famously throws into the air and blasts out of the sky in the original cartoon introduction. And finally, I don't know if this would be considered much of a stretch, but when news of the first live-action G.I. Joe movie broke out in early 2000, I was almost pretty sure that Stalker had a very good chance of making the cut for the good guys. And when actor Marlon Wayans was announced as part of the cast, I thought, not my first choice, but I guess he could pull off Stalker. But then it was announced that he would be playing Ripcord. Huh? Well, even if it's not confirmed, my take is that given Wayans' Ripcord played the role of the best friend to Channing Tatum's Duke, the character was meant to be Stalker in essence, but I figured that they just couldn't use the name Stalker for obvious negative reasons. Oh well, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.